In previous examples, we've built a basic micro application where we're really just pulling from a static external JSON resource and rendering all that content on the screen. There was really no interactivity. We hadn't written any actual JavaScript, but we did a pretty good job of showing how we could pull information from some external data source and use the templating engine to display that information on the screen. In this example, I want to look at a little bit more interactivity. We're going to explore some of the additional JavaScript functions that we can call that make this interactive. We can take a look at some of those here. We've got a whole bunch of different functions that we can call, and we're going to start with that. So let's go ahead and take our Hello World app instance here, and I'm going to actually just copy this whole application and start a new application where we show those examples. So we'll go here into the admin tool, and we're going to go into micro apps here. And let's take a look at Hello World, and I'm going to click on this little button up here and click Export. So what this is going to do is give me a full definition of my Hello World application. And so let's close that out. We're going to make a new application here called Hello World 2, if we can. Go back to micro applications. We'll call this Hello World 2. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to import that other definition that we just had there. So we effectively have just copied our micro application, our Hello World micro application, and now we've got a Hello World micro application too. Since all we've done though is cloned the application, you'll notice that we don't actually have any instances over here, so we're going to have to take care of that as well. So let's go into our groups. The group that we've defined these things, we've got our Hello World app instance here, and I'm going to go ahead and create a Hello World 2. So let's go to Hello World 2. We'll call it Hello World 2. Hello World 2. All right, so this one, yeah, we can make it listed here. That looks good. And then we just need to go in here and set up our resources that we had set before. So we're now pointing at that endpoint. So if we go ahead and look at this application, it should be effectively the same application that we had before. We had Hello World, and now we've got Hello World 2. So they're really the same application. They've just been instantiated, just been copied over. But that's not really particularly interesting. We've already dealt with this before. What we want to do is start adding some interactivity here. So what can we do? If we go over to the Graphene micro app documentation, so I'm actually looking here at the Graphene Wiki. We go into the wiki, and over here on the right-hand side, you'll notice that there's micro app JavaScript helper functions, and there's a whole list of functions here that we can pull from. So we've got an alert, a click event. We've got some of our Ajax verbs here. So we've got a delete, a get, a post, and a put. So those are all there. We've got the ability to integrate with forms. There's a data grid function here that we probably won't get into in this particular one, but we'll get into that a little bit later. We can push open modals. We can update our app user options. We talked about post and put. We can refresh the entire application. We can force the application to render a mustache type string, and we can just do a basic update to the object. So let's take a look at some of these here, and we'll try to understand what's going on. So in order to really get into this, let's go back into our application, and let's open the script tab, because that's something that we hadn't really been into previously. So we'll go here and click Edit Micro Application, and we're going to look at scripts. So just so you understand the order in which scripts execute, because it gets a little bit complicated, I'm going to pull up this documentation over here, and we're going to take a look at this image. So you'll notice here that we've got kind of a linear flow in terms of how things execute from thing to thing. And so when we are loading the initial micro application, the first thing that it's going to do is fetch all of those resources. And that's something that we talked about over here. If we go to our resources, we were fetching this get data resource. That's where we were getting that JSON file. So it's pulling that in first. Then it's pulling in all the user preferences. And I don't remember if I've talked about that previously, but we can set up user options that are pulled in, and those are pulled in. And then we get in all of the information about the currently authenticated user. So we have their unique ID, we have their first name, their last name, their email address. All of that stuff is kind of prefetched and pulled in and put in the data object. So when we were looking at, I think, the data before that we were rendering in the template over here, all of that stuff is pulled in at initial load. So that's happening here. And then we go in and we start executing the JavaScript, right? So if I start typing JavaScript, let's go back into here. If I start typing JavaScript right here, what's going to happen is it's going to execute that, but you'll notice that it's actually executing the JavaScript before it actually renders the template. So if there's any JavaScript that we want to interact with that is actually post the template rendering, we need to define a callback function, and that's something else that we'll get into it in a second. So just to go over this again, we are loading the application, we're pulling in all of our resources, all of our data objects, all our information about the user, we're executing that JavaScript file that's there. We are then rendering the template, and then we call that callback function if that thing exists. So if I go ahead and look at an example here, let's see. So I'm going to put a debugger here, and I'm just going to go ahead and save this, and let's go and run this thing. We'll go over here, and I'm going to open up the inspector. And what we're going to expect to see when I click refresh is that this application is going to run. We're going to pull back some network traffic to get all of our data, but this thing is still spinning here, right? And we've executed into the debugger here, but we're still spinning. We haven't actually loaded the template yet. So if I go ahead and click play, once I do that, only then will everything actually start loading in the template. So if there's anything that you want to do with the data in terms of massaging the data or manipulating the data before that initial template loads, that's where you would do it. Then I mentioned the callback, and this is another function that actually gets called after the template is loaded. So let's do that here. Function. Okay, oops, that's not quite right. And I'm going to put another debugger right here. So we now have two debuggers, one that's going to get loaded before the template and another that's going to get loaded after the template is in there. So let's go ahead and save that, and let's refresh again and see what happens. So as expected, we saw that we're now in the debugger here. The template is not loaded yet. It's still spinning. I'm going to click play. Now the template is actually loaded and everything, and now we're in this callback function with another debugger. So the key thing to kind of keep in mind is outside of the callback, we can do data manipulation, we can massage our data before the template is loaded, but really any sort of interactivity that we might want to do after the template is loaded is going to have to be inside of that callback, or at least calling a function from within that callback function. And that's clearly defined here, so we can look at this thing, you can see what the order is there. But then also over here in this documentation, you'll see that these functions call by app.whatever are really required to be called from within the callback function. So note while app.data is available most everywhere, so that is available externally, the app helper functions mentioned in this document are only available within the context of this .callback function. So please ensure that you have defined a callback function to make sure that you can actually do that stuff. So really everything we're going to be talking about today is going to be done within this callback function, not outside here in this general space. Okay, so now that we've gotten that explained, let's go ahead and add some sort of interactivity here. And probably the best thing to get started with is really just a basic click event. So let's go ahead and look at this one and see how this is defined. What we can see here is that it's really just call app.click, and then we have a CSS selector that we're going to bind to, and then we just have a button or an event that's going to get called back when the click actually happens. So let's go ahead and set that up now. We're going to have to go into our template. We're going to have to define a button. We're going to have to give it some sort of identifier that we can bind to, and then in our script, we're going to put this in here. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's actually just use this example exactly as written. So we'll go into here, paste this in. Tab that in properly, and it looks like this is defining to a button with an ID of my-button. So let's go ahead and define a button with an ID of my-button. So I'm going to use some basic Bootstrap. We're actually using Bootstrap 3, I believe. So we'll do a div class equals btn primary, and then I'll do an ID, which I believe this was, let me just go back and check, my-button. So we'll do my-button. Here we go, like this, and we'll say click me, right? So we've got a button here. It's in the template. It's got an ID of my-button, and then over here we've got a we've got an event bound to that button. And I'm just going to throw another debugger in here so we can see when that actually happens. So we'll do a save, come back over here, and let's refresh our application. So everything looks exactly the same, except now we've got a button here that says click me. And when I click on it, we'll notice that we actually get our debugger to show up here. So that's not super interesting, but you can start to see where we're starting to bind to interactive elements, and we can do things with that. So what else can we do over here? Let's go back to the top. And let's start with alert. So an alert is based on just kind of these, it's a library called Toaster, which allows us to put up these little messages on the screen. So let's copy this here, and let's go ahead and put this inside of our click event. So instead of doing a debugger, we're going to do an app.click, or an app.alert rather. There we go. Okay, so these are just some basic CSS classes. If you want to understand more about how the alert thing is working, you can actually look at Toaster, JS Toaster here. This is just an open source library that we're borrowing from, and we've got a little wrapper around it. But effectively, it's doing everything that we talked about here. So we can go ahead and look at this, and you can see we're going to use a warning class, so that's going to make us it's going to be yellow, and then we're going to have a title of hello and a content of world. So let's go ahead and save that, and let's go ahead and refresh. And click this button again. And so you'll see over here we've got hello world, right? So it's a little warning thing, it's yellow, the title is hello, and the content is world. And we can actually click that as many times as we want to, and of course that's going to trigger that event over and over and over again. So that's just a little bit more interactivity. Let's go ahead and look at some more of these things. So we've talked about alert, we've talked about click. I'm not going to get into the CRUD functions, the AJAX functions yet. We won't get into form just yet. But let's see, we can open up a modal. That's going to be very similar to the alert, but let's go ahead and copy this one in here. So we'll do a modal, app.modal, and we'll actually do both. We'll do a hello world as an alert, and we'll also do the hello world as a modal. It's going to effectively be, as you can see here, the way that you define these things is almost exactly the same, but the way that they render is slightly different. So we'll go ahead and save that. Click the button again, and I'm actually going to get out of the inspector here. So click that there, and looks like we got our hello world event. Oh, did I not refresh? I probably didn't refresh. So I'm going to go ahead and click this here, and you'll notice that this thing shows up down here, and then we've also got a modal up here. So we get, you can see how you can have different types of things. So depending on if you just want to splash a little message on the screen really quickly, you can do that here, or if you wanted to use a more permanent modal that they have to dismiss, you can do that up here. So let's see. We can go back into here. Maybe we want to change some of the content and put something else in here. And I think you can put full HTML in here if you wanted to. We'll say, here is a header, and here is some text. Right. Oops. Close that out there. Save that. And I'm going to get rid of the alert for the time being because we're really just focusing on the modal. Refresh, and let's see what we get. So yep, you can see we can do all kinds of interesting things with modals. So again, as we're getting into this, we can get more and more complicated in terms of what we're trying to do, but there is a little bit more interactivity with these callback functions. What else do we have here? We've got our modal, app.options. I'm not going to get into that one quite yet. Post and put, those are of course both CRUD verbs. We've got an app.refresh. We can try that one as well. And then, yeah, we've got a app.update and an app.render. So let's go ahead and try our app.refresh. Now, what an app.refresh does is it's kind of a nuclear option. If you ever really just want to totally blow away your application and start back over again, refetching all of the stuff. And I believe if I look at this documentation here, yeah, you can see that really takes us all the way back to the beginning here. Normally what you would want to do is just kind of maintain your context internally and do some updates or whatever. But if you truly just want to restart the entire application over again, refetch all your data, re-execute everything from the ground up again, you can do an app.refresh. So let's go add another button here for an app.refresh. And I think what I'm going to do is, let's put this in a new row, so that we're not just having these things hang off the end. So we'll do that there, and we'll do another row here. And these, of course, are just bootstrap grid things. So we'll do another button. So we've got my button already here, and then we're going to have this be called a refresh button. And we'll make this one say refresh everything. Okay, and so we've got that here, and instead of button primary, we're going to make this button danger. So we'll make it a little bit red. Doesn't like my CSS. What did I do wrong here? Okay, there we go. I'm not really sure what exactly we had wrong in our HTML, but it was throwing some errors there. Okay, so we've got a new button here called my refresh button, and we're going to bind to that one as well. So let's go back to our script, and we're going to copy this here. And instead of binding to my button, we're going to bind to my refresh button, and instead of doing the modal or the alert, we're just going to do an app.refresh like that. Perfect. Go ahead and save, and if we refresh here, so now we've got a refresh everything button, so we can click on click me, and of course that brings up our modal, and if we click on refresh everything, you'll notice that it respins everything. It's going to fetch all our data all over again, and it should start and restart the entire application from scratch. So that can be really handy if we're trying to do a full refetch of all of the data, just to kind of restart everything back over again from scratch. Okay, so that's some really basic interactivity. I'm going to talk a little bit actually about app.update though, because this is where it gets really neat that we can actually update some of our data and then tell the template to update itself without having to actually do that full refresh that we just did. So the refresh thing is really more, hopefully more than what we actually need to accomplish. So if we look at this app.update function, this function updates the app data object and instructs the template rendering engine to re-render the templates with updated data. This function should be called whenever the app data object is updated. Optionally, this function may accept the parameters which will directly update the app data object. So when I talk about the app data object, what am I talking about? Well, let's go ahead and throw a debugger right up here in our callback function, and we can inspect what all of this stuff is that we're talking about. So let's go ahead and save that. There we go. And let's go back into here and let's inspect, and let's look at the and let's refresh this. This is going to bring us into a debugger when we refresh. And if we go into the console here, what I'm going to do is just type app.data, since we keep talking about this app data object. And what we'll see in here is we've got a whole bunch of information. We've got our get data resource, right? This is all of the hello world stuff, and this is all the information that we had about cats. This was the stuff that was pulled down externally. We've actually got our user options, which we haven't really talked about just yet, but those are options that are specific to this particular instance. And then we've also got information about this particular user here. So, and if we go back to this other little diagram that we saw here, you'll notice that we had those resources. That was the JSON data. We have our preferences, our user options, and then we've also got that user data. So all of these things here are prefetched, and they're part of this general app data object. It's kind of this persistent thing that carries with us anywhere within the application. And what's nice about the app data object is that that data object is always available within the template. So that's how we were able to render sad cat, tiny kitten, and belly, because if we look at get data here, we can see those are what those things are there. But what's kind of neat is that we could, in theory, actually update this app data object and then tell the template engine that we want, that we updated the object, and then we can actually interact with what's displayed here. So, for example, if we wanted to change this cat's name, we could do that by updating it in JavaScript and then calling the app.update function, which would actually tell the template engine to go update the DOM accordingly. So let's go ahead and try to do that. We've got get data, we've got cats, and we've got 0. So maybe we can actually just try to do something like that. So let's go ahead and add another button, and we'll do that here by saying, let's see, we'll do rename cat button. It's going to call rename a cat. Okay, and we'll make this one be a, I don't know what color that should be. We'll make it a warning, so it's yellow. Warning. Okay, so we've got our rename a cat button here. We do need to bind to it over here. And let's make sure I grab this name correctly right here. So we'll save that. And instead of doing an app.refresh, we are going to do an app.update. But before we do the app.update, what we're going to do is we're going to actually change that cat's name. So we're going to go to getData.cats_0.name, and we're going to change it. So let's go to app.data.get_data.cats_0.name. And let's change this to, let's see, what's an appropriate name for this cat? We'll call it Gray Cat. Okay. So we are actually updating that data object, and then we are instructing the application to tell the template engine that we updated the data object, and then it is going to go out there and potentially update that object accordingly. So if we go back over here, we'll refresh, and let's see what happens. Oh, we've got our debugger in there still. Let's get rid of our debugger. We don't need that anymore. And I'm going to close this out here. And you'll notice we've got our new button here called Rename a Cat. And if we look at this cat here, it says Sad Cat. But if we click on Rename a Cat, now it's called Gray Cat. So you can see with the update function, we're actually able to update the data object, which is then tells the templating engine that we need to update the data object and all of the affiliated things, and we're actually able to update the DOM. Now, what's really nice about the update function is that since we're using a tool called Ractive for our templating as opposed to something like Mustache or something else, it's actually managing a virtual DOM on the back end. So it's really only updating the parts of the DOM that have changed. So potentially if you have other things over here that you want to persist in a certain state, or you've got classes that you're managing or whatever, it's not going to touch any of that stuff. It's really only going to update the parts of the DOM that it realizes have changed based on the changes in the data object. And that's a important thing to notice, because as we get into more and more complicated things, it's really helpful that we can keep everything as is and only update the parts that have meaningfully changed. Okay, now I'm going to get into one last thing we're going to talk about really quickly. This is probably going to require an entire separate video, but we're going to talk about forms, because forms are really important for interacting with data and updating data, and that's probably the most common thing that we're going to end up doing elsewhere in here. So you'll notice that we had here, we said that we were changing the cat's name. We were just statically changing it here to Gray Cat. But what if we wanted to ask or prompt the user for some cat, for a proper cat name, and we wanted that to show up in there? Well, we could do that, and the easiest way to do that is using this Forms tab over here. So over in the Forms tab, you'll notice that we've got two predefined forms. We have options, which are options that are kind of administrative options associated with the application, and then we've got this user options thing that I keep kind of alluding to, but we haven't gotten into in any real detail. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new form called cat name form. Okay, so we'll call that here, and this is going to be cat name. And what we can do is, all we really need about this cat is just the name of the cat. So I'm going to drag a new input field onto here, and we're just going to say cat's name, and I'm just going to call this name here. Okay, so we've got a form. It's called cat_name, and we've got a single field in the form called name. All right, that's an important thing to notice, because we're going to reference that over here elsewhere. Now, if we go back to our cheat sheet here and we look at app.form, you can see that what we can do is we can actually bind to the name of the form. So we actually created a new form called cat name, and we can either tell that form to be bound to a DOM object somewhere, or as you can see in the second object, or in the second example, we can actually open that up in a modal. And so let's go ahead and try this example. I'm just going to copy this whole thing out of here. And let's go over here, and in our scripts, we are going to, and you'll notice again, we're still in that callback function. Oops, I'll tab everything in. There we go. Okay, so we've got app.form, and we need to know the name of our form, and that was, if we go over here, that was cat name. So we'll grab that, cat name. All right, and then on save, so we're gonna have two default actions that are associated with this, is on save and cancel. So on save, we are going to get the data out of the form, right? So this is all the data that was in the form. And then initially here, all we're going to do, because we copied the example, is we're going to log that data to the console, and then we're going to close the modal. And then similarly on a cancel event, so if somebody clicks the cancel button, we're just going to close the modal, right? So we're not actually doing anything yet. We're not updating the DOM. We're not updating the names or anything. All we're doing is we're going to open the form, and we're going, on the save event, we're going to print out the data. Now you'll notice that right now, at least, this form is going to open as soon as the application opens, because we're not triggering the form to open up on a click event or anything like that. So as soon as I click refresh here on the application, it's gonna open up this form in a modal, which is probably not what we want, but that's okay for the time being. Let's see. Okay, let's go ahead and save this here, and we'll go back over here, and we're going to expect that this form is going to open as soon as I do that. So yep, that makes sense. And I'm going to open up our inspector just so we can see the console here. And I'm going to type in, some cat name. We'll go ahead and click save, and then I'm going to expect it to see down here, because that's what we're doing. So here we have name is some cat name. Okay, perfect. That worked exactly the way we expected. But instead of having the form just open up automatically as soon as I load the application, really what I'd like to do is take this whole thing and put it inside of this function right here, inside of our rename cat function. So that makes a lot more sense. So we'll put that in here. Okay, that looks good. I'm going to fix some of my indenting here because it looks like we're using 2 spaces versus 4 spaces in the examples. And we'll comment out this stuff here. And I'm not going to change anything else other than we're going to put this form inside of that rename cat button function. Okay, so let's go ahead and save and go back to this tab, refresh once again. Now this time we're not expecting the form to open up. Nope. And as soon as I click the rename a cat button, the form does open up. We can say cat's name, here is my name. We'll go ahead and press save. There it is, it displays in the console. So now the last thing that we need to do is down here, instead of where we were hard coding gray cat, we are going to grab that name and then we're going to do an app.update. So let's go ahead inside of this function where we're doing the save. We're going to get rid of the console.log, so we'll comment that out. And we've already got our form data object, so I'm just going to grab these 2 things here and move them up here. We'll fix our tabs a little bit. Oh man, we are all over the place. Okay, so pull that one back. There we go. Okay. And so instead of the name being gray cat, we're going to do form data dot name. And the reason we're doing dot name again is because that was the name that we gave to that particular field. So that's important. So we'll do form data dot name or form name dot name, and then we're going to do an app.update, and then we're going to close the modal. So if this all works correctly, we are going to go back into this application, and I'm going to close this inspector here. We're going to refresh. If I click me here, that's going to open up our modal, right? That's from before. If I click refresh everything, that's going to refresh our entire application. But if I click rename a cat, we're going to go over here and say, here is my new name. And if everything works correctly, this text over here next to sad cat is going to be updated. So let's go ahead and do that. Nope, that didn't quite work correctly. So let's go ahead and look at our inspector and see what just happened. So if I look at this, form name is not defined. So let's see what I did incorrectly here. It's not form name, it's form data. Okay, so yeah, the form data is the data from the form, so it's form data.name. All right, so let's go ahead and save that. Close out here again, refresh. And as soon as this comes back, let's see, we'll click on rename a cat. Final try, this will definitely work. All right, click save. And there we go, we've updated that thing there. So that's as far as I'm going to get to in this particular video. We've talked about a bunch of the different functions. We've got alert, we talked about click, we talked about form just in a little bit. We haven't gotten too deep into form. We talked about modal, we talked about refresh, and we talked about update. And so with those, you can actually do quite a bit of capability, a lot of functionality in terms of how we can interact with form elements, with applications. Now, in the next video, probably going to talk a little bit more about these CRUD functions, so get, post, put, and delete, so we can actually interact with resources dynamically. But for this particular example, all we were showing is how to interact dynamically with applications, with different events and stuff like that, and getting data from the end user. All right, that's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next one.